so without too much further ado, if you want to read more details, I've got detailed bios on them. But we're going to let these guys, they're going to handle most of it. I might interject about some Canadian code stuff, but mostly we'll let them inspire about their work in the States.
So, greetings everyone. I know I'm really happy to be there virtually. Sorry you couldn't be there in person. This is Martin speaking. And I think Tim, we were going to say a bit about each other or about ourselves before we launched into this, but I think Tim did a great job introducing me, David, and Anthony. You good with that?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So we'll just get into it. There's a bit to cover here, and let's see. Unfortunately, that's having a problem right out of the gate here. There we go.
Well, everybody, I'm Anthony Dente, licensed civil engineer in the state of California, number 80,715. I'm also licensed across the United States in various states. And this is my team based in Berkeley, California, Verdant Structural Engineers, and anything that I credit that I've done, I've done in collaboration with these wonderful people. There's one former employee on this slide that I left on there, Ellie Turwheel, who I saw joined on Zoom here. She moved back up to Canada to be with you all, and I believe is a licensed Canadian engineer now, so get in touch with her. She's there if you'd like. And I can get you in touch if you don't know how, if you don't know her already. I'm also the Vice President of the Cobb Research Institute, which ties into our work here, and the CEO of our new company, Verdant Building Products, which probably won't tie in here. Next slide. So I just want to say that it's a real bummer not to be there in person with you. It looks like a lot of fun, but I am grateful we get to do this. And you may be wondering, why are three stinking Americans who practice primarily in codes adopted in the United States talking to us here in Canada at our Canadian gathering? And I think it's for two reasons. One, because our strategy and approach for greening our building codes here might be helpful to you as an example, but two, because of the technical information that we put into these codes also might be directly applicable to you. The physical constraints of our world do not end at the borders, and this is the first time I'll mention this book we just published with New Society Publishing out of Canada, with Michael Smith and Massey Burke, and Martin was a contributing author. And we made the effort to take the code tables and charts and images and span them between both countries in trying to make the book as applicable to both the US and Canada as possible. This book isn't just helpful for people designing cob or clay systems. You might find it useful for these factors, but yeah, that's why we believe this might be an interesting presentation for you, and I'll let David take it from here.
Next slide. So, I've been at the dealing with building codes and natural building for, I don't know, 25 years more maybe. And it was an interesting process. Martin, why don't you go to the next slide? And a lot of it had to do with helping code officials see that they were actually focused on a set of hazards associated with the built environment that were not the full set of hazards associated with the built environment, and finding ways to talk about that with them that actually got through to them, kind of expanding their frame of reference for thinking about what they were doing. It took a long time. I had this revelation. I created this set of slides about 20 years ago. Next slide. So you see in the center there the hazards that the codes typically address, and I was pointing out that buildings are actually producing a whole other larger set of hazards that you can't see while you're looking through the microscope of building codes. And next slide, and that in fact, the reality is that to deal appropriately with hazards attributable to the built environment, you need to be able to see them all, and work on balancing them. It's not either or, it's about recognizing how buildings are impacting all kinds of things and what we do, and how even building codes can make hazards away from the building huge, like climate change, for example. And typically what's happening, you can go to the next slide, was that whenever we would bring up issues around the environment or, toxicity, basically what we would hear from code officials was it's not in their remit, it's, outside of their purview. And I would point out the purpose statement of our building codes here in the US that basically has a bunch of detail in here, but
Do you want to jump in, Martin?
Yeah, it seems David, you're back?
yeah,
You froze there for a moment.
am I there?
You're back now. You froze as you were getting into it.
Okay, I'll try not to freeze again. So anyway, essentially the purpose is in white. Go to the next slide, Martin. And basically those things were actually part of their responsibility, even though they didn't think they were. Next slide. One of the things that's happened is that they've changed the purpose statement, and one of the things they eliminated was other hazards attributed to the built environment, which was kind of a shock when Martin and I went back and were looking at this and noticed that. Next slide. But what's happened in the last few years is suddenly the International Code Council in the US, the organization that creates the US codes, they started actually recognizing a bunch of things like climate change, embodied carbon. Next slide. And water issues, and all kinds of things suddenly started showing up in their newsletters and in committees they were creating, and that's been really good. Next slide. And then just in the last few weeks, the ICC board basically overruled the Energy Code Committee, basically undermining a bunch of decarbonization provisions that have been shown up. So it's a back and forth process, but things are moving forward in a way that only took about 30 years to get moving. Next slide. Martin, I think it's...
Yeah, so I'll go from here. Just a bit about the natural building codes that currently exist in the US, and we'll talk a bit later about how these might translate into Canada and elsewhere. As David mentioned a moment ago, the International Code Council, ICC, they're the body, it's a nonprofit entity that oversees the code development for model building codes and other codes in the US. And they're kind of the glaring issue here is in the name of the organization, the International Code Council. Many of the codes, the model codes that are created under ICC's oversight are used internationally, in particular in parts of South America and in the Middle East, but many of them aren't, or in many countries, most countries throughout the world, they don't use the ICC codes, including Canada. So some of it's aspirational, built into their name, but they are the model codes that the ICC helped create they're model codes. They're literally available to anyone who chooses, to any jurisdiction, national, state, provincial, county, city that chooses to use them. This is just a quick summary of the natural so-called, we'll use the term natural building codes that are in the International Residential Code, which is limited to 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses. So uses or occupancies outside of that are not covered. Those are covered in the International Building Code. But it started with the second and third ones on this list, the straw clay and straw bale appendices, and then followed actually somewhat by accident, tiny houses, which is not directly a natural building code certainly, but related. Then cob construction, and then most recently hemp lime. And then these are other natural building codes in the U.S. that exist or are being planned. Just have a quick read of those. And also a mention of important international, or at least one very important international example, the New Zealand earth building standards. And there are others, especially the straw bale, like in France, for example. But mainly this is a list of U.S. codes. Yeah, and as I mentioned, the IRC it's one of the I codes. There's this family of I codes, including plumbing and mechanical, and just to also emphasize that these are model codes. They have no enforceable standing of their own. They must be adopted by a jurisdiction in order to be enforceable. And they are the basis of the building codes for virtually every U.S. jurisdiction, and as I mentioned, they are available for adoption and use worldwide. So a little bit just specifically what's in the codes. We'll highlight first the straw bale construction code. All of these appendices they place limits on the system. So you can see at the bottom, it's approved for 1-story buildings, height less than 25 feet, and in the lower side of the design categories. Although that's with the prescriptive use of this code, they are allowed for uses that exceed 1 story or exceed 25 feet in height with an engineered design. And this is just the kind of outline of the straw bale appendix, but we use a similar outline for the other appendices like cob and straw, clay, and hemp. It was just a good way to organize all of them. Similar, there you can see some of the limitations for what was Appendix AR, or the letter designations changed recently just to be confusing. But and then here's some images and the limitations for the cob appendix. You can see that one in the upper right says since 2021 IRC. And for the tiny house appendix, it was something we stumbled on. It started with me simply testifying in support of a proposal relating to this. So it's remarkable how in this arena, one thing leads to another. This is a prime example, and also how relationships are built between people who work in this realm, and it takes a long time to develop those relationships and get all of these things across the finish line. Most recently, this is the hemp lime appendix in Canada. I know you guys are ahead of us in the U.S. because it was only in 2018 when hemp was approved or was made legal as an agricultural crop in the U.S. And of course, France preceded Canada. That's where the hemp lime or hempcrete system originated. Anthony?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. And if it's not clear to anyone, or if it's helpful for the question and answer period that we plan to have at the end, that Martin was the lead author on most of the, or co-author on all the IRC codes in that table earlier, with David right by his side. And I've been the lead engineer on a number of these, and we've all been involved in almost all the codes mentioned that are US-based on both of those sides too. So if you have questions about any of them, but one important one is the Adobe chapter in the IBC. And if you're building with Adobe, it's got some tricky avenues. It's been around since in its current form since the 80s, and then far before that. It's slated to be removed, but for anyone familiar with our reference codes in the US, masonry is governed by the Masonry Society Code, TMS, they abbreviate that, 402. And we now have a committee in TMS 402 for contemporary Adobe Masonry section. And I just volunteered to be the chair of the structural portion of that. And so that's underway. This code is, as it currently stands, is not removed yet, but only applies structurally to seismic design category A and is quite limited. So it can be as unhelpful as it is helpful. And I can talk more about that if people have questions. Next slide. A lot of these code sections we're talking about are appendices or sections of their own that have a title. This is one that we were able to expand the use of rubble trench, crushed stone, or crushed gravel footings. These are three terms meant to refer to the same thing. This we found existed in the International Residential Code, but only for precast and wood foundations. And if anyone has questions on what those are, they're not used as much, and for good reasons I can explain that. But when you're able to take small steps in the building code realm, it's a lot easier to foster success. And so we just simply took the language they were using for those and allowed it, next slide, to be used for cast-in-place concrete footings. So you can get a good concrete cap at the base of your building. Next slide, Martin. Good concrete cap at the base of your building. It receives your anchors, but if you're got to go deep into the soil to reach competent bearing or frost line, you don't have to do that with the high embodied carbon concrete. And we're working on expanding this even further. And this, I was mentioning, next slide, this element is one that's just in the body of the IRC. It has a section title of its own, but it's a section within a greater chapter. And so elements like this, they might not come as big news items, but they might affect more people. This is a broadly applicable technique to save carbon. Here's an example on a project that Martin and I both worked on. And it's maybe not the most photogenic system, but it can save a lot of carbon. Next slide.
No, that's me.
Yes, I think that's you.
Yes.
One thing that's really important to understand, at least in the U.S., is that, Martin mentioned that, I think he mentioned that maybe not. The appendices are not automatically adopted. The local jurisdiction adopts one of these codes, like a version of the IRC. The appendices have to be adopted separately, or they don't come automatically with the base code. But the reality is that even if the jurisdiction you're in hasn't adopted, an appendix, you can reference it, and it's often extremely useful for code officials, because what it gives them is what they need. It's already vetted by the International Code Council, and it gives them what they need to be able to plan, review, and inspect a project, and have some cover, for the liability of approving something that's sort of outside of what they're used to doing. So it's like if it's not adopted, basically you may have to do it kind of as a project by project basis. Also, the codes, go ahead, Martin, next slide. All the I-codes come in two versions. One, just the straight code language, and you can get a code and commentary version, which includes essentially information to help both code officials and code users know how to interpret the various provisions of the code. And we've been really fortunate in building the relationships that we have over the years with ICC that they've actually allowed us to write the code commentary for the appendices, and in fact for the Adobe section in the IBC as well, which is, or at least to edit that one significantly, which basically has allowed us to give code officials a lot more background and some leeway in terms of how to interpret various things that are in the code and what things to pay attention to. And you can see here, there's two copies or two versions of the IRC with commentary. It took 2 volumes because the IRC is a single volume code, but the commentary added a lot of additional text. And here you can see, basically about twice as much commentary as code language. But anyway, it's been an incredibly valuable opportunity for us to kind of shape this background information that code officials get to use. Next slide. And Anthony mentioned this book. There's also a really good book that CASBA, the California Straw Building Association, produced a few years ago on straw bale details. And there are more and more really good resources for all of these things that we're working on. And one of the things I want to point out about the Cobb book is that it has a lot of engineering information and kind of context that you won't find anyplace else. And what Anthony talked about those graphics of both seismic and climate zones that they combined, it's really valuable to see, how these things actually relate to where you are. And there are other, the whole essential sustainable building series that New Society put out. There's another really good one, Jacob McCuson, on building science, and there are others, but these are really excellent resources. So just slip back for a minute to talk about how long these processes take. So the last Straw Journal, Mads Meerman and Judy Knox started that journal back in 1993. I wrote the cover story. This first phase, the testing program completed. That was here in Tucson, city of Tucson and Pima County. We developed the first straw bale, load-bearing straw bale code. So that was winter of '93. Then the next year, I wrote this article, Building Code, Straw Bale Construction, and You. And this was my great mistake that actually inadvertently turned me into the straw bale codes guy, which I was until Martin years later took over, thankfully, and I got to work on a bunch of larger issues. But anyway, so there's volume 1, number 1, volume 2, number 5. Next slide. A dozen years later, there we go. Martin guest edited this issue of The Last Straw, which focused on building codes all over the world. It's kind of amazing how much had happened in a dozen years. And I was incredibly grateful for Martin doing this, that I didn't do it. I didn't have to do it.
You're welcome.
And next slide. So it only took 20 years. So remember that first issue was 93. In 2013, in Dallas at the code hearings, we got approval for the straw bale appendix. And Light Straw Clay slipped in on straw bale's coattails. And so Martin, I think we tried 3 or 4 previous times to get straw bale into the code unsuccessfully, and finally in 2013 we did that, and it went into the 2015 IRC.
So I think this is me. Yes, I have a bit about how we changed the codes. David, some of it's been alluded to already, but in the ICC process, it's a 3-year cycle. It might be, I don't know what the cycle is in Canada, the year cycle, I'm not sure, and Tim will maybe say something about that later. Anyway, it's a 3-year cycle. You can see this list of hearings that occur over the course of a little more than a year. This was just to give you a glimpse into the system or the environment that we inhabit in the U.S. code environment. This is the hearing in 2013 when the straw bale appendix was first approved. And at the end of the hearings, at the end of the testimony for each proposal, the committee members, usually 10 to 13 committee members on the dais, they have a discussion among themselves and they make comments. In this case, this was at the end of the testimony for the straw clay proposal. A particular committee member, he said his piece, and then he recommended to the other committee members that they vote to approve. And the next thing he said was this. And I know I was absolutely stunned, pleasantly stunned by this, but it was really great to hear that these committee members, at least this one, it seemed that the tide was changing. We, as David said, we struggled with 3 proposals in the International Green Construction Code, the International Building Code, and then finally we broke through with the International Residential Code. So things are changing for the better. Fast forward almost 10 years. This was the most recent vote to approve the hemp lime or hempcrete appendix, and that was done on the first time. We did it the first hearing, and so that too speaks to the fact that it takes time to learn the process and become better at it. And also, as Anthony mentioned at the outset with his team at Burden Structural Engineers, this was the hemp lime team or hempcrete team. David is conspicuously absent because I forget now why they weren't.
Yeah, I didn't attend because
of health reasons.
COVID.
Yeah, there's that. Yes. But this was a really solid team, and it does take teamwork. Anthony, David, and I have been leading many of these efforts, but we certainly don't do it alone. Anthony?
Yeah, thank you. Canadian Building Codes, thank you, Tim Cron, who I'm happy to say I've been really pleased to collaborate with for years. He's a gem, as you all likely know, more than I. But thank you for these slides. For anyone who doesn't work with the Canadian Building Codes day in and day out, your codes are slightly different than ours. Your main code is objective-based and functional statement-based code and not necessarily the performance and strength-based code that the IBC is based on. There's caveats to that. I'll just say right now, all of these codes, New Zealand's is a dominantly performance-based code, but they all cross the lines and blur areas. Strength-based codes have prescriptive requirements, and vice versa. So if you're getting confused about those categories, you're not alone. And there's kind of no right answer, and we could talk about that forever if you want to, but we probably only have 10 minutes during the question and answer period. But there is Part 9 for small buildings that's prescriptive, and the IRC, which we've been talking about, is our prescriptive code. It's a pre-engineered code. It's like a cookbook. Do this. If your building's this big, do this. And if you're outside the scope of that, you also have the opportunity to submit an alternative solution. So next slide. And your community has developed resources for you. And Martin and David were just telling me that they had the opportunity to collaborate in the development of some of these. And so these are available to you, and questions should go to Tim and your other community members on exactly the best ways to engage with these. But next slide. Your codes are also developed nationally, but administered provincially and territory-wise, and there is a desire and push to nationalize the whole system. Now, currently, our system does the same thing. Our states adopt these individually, and it would be wonderful if that wasn't the case. Trying to get these adopted state by state is maddening after you went all through the effort of writing them and getting them approved in the first place. Next slide. And as David was mentioning, we see the tides turning towards green acceptance and green focus in our codes. The same is happening in Canada with some of these priorities highlighted right here. Next slide. And if you want to change your building code, you have a process as well. And some of your countrymen have engaged in it. And this is the form requirement for that proposal, and next slide we'll see a response for code change that was proposed for straw bale construction. It was ultimately denied here, but the comments in response, we talked about the way we kind of get our comments live at the hearing. It's a little bit different, but there's not too many wildly different ways you can go about doing something like this. So it's probably a lot more similarities than differences. Next slide. And great. I don't know if I have much to say about this.
Well, Anthony, Anthony spoke to this a minute ago, but just about participating in getting the in code development at different levels, and it is similar. The Canadian process does seem to be very similar to what we do in the U.S., and we need the same. Actually, Anthony, David, and I are right now with another colleague, Sasha Rabin, trying to get people all across the U.S. to help adopt the model codes that we've been able to
The appendices.
that we've managed to get approved by ICC.
And if you know anyone in the States that wants to engage in that effort, it will be a big, long, and tedious effort that we're just officially kicked off a couple months ago. And the codes that are coming next, slated, I mentioned the Adobe code that's being worked on with TMS, and that's an exciting transition because this will not be an appendix in a prescriptive code. This will be a section approved by our official TMS document in the body of the International Building Code, which is our strength-based and performance-based building code. CalEarth, with their Super Adobe system, has hired us to do case studies to see what an IRC appendix might look like for the EarthBag Super Adobe system. And expansion of all these into higher seismic categories and into the IBC. When we head into higher seismic categories into the IBC, there's a seismic barrier that requires notably more testing. We'll talk about testing in a minute, but there is also an ASTM standard for earthen floors under development. It's a bit stalled, but I'm very hopeful we'll get that running again. ASTM standards can be even more kind of cross-boundary implementable than the I codes at times.
David?
Yeah. So one of the things that's been happening, is recognition of embodied carbon. And you guys have Chris Magwood, who is like the absolute international rock star in this realm. Just in codes, been really influencing thinking about all of this. And we kind of stole him away to the U.S. He's now been hired by the Rocky Mountain Institute and is managing their embodied carbon program. And it's extraordinary. And one of the things that they've initiated is this thing with ResNet, which and the HERS ratings, which are energy ratings for buildings. This is a process that one of the long-standing problems in the U.S. in our codes realm has been a kind of attitude among a lot of building officials that energy codes are not, or at least for a long time, we're not life safety issues, that they were something that, the building department shouldn't be dealing with. And one of the things that happened was that ResNet, that organization, came along and really developed a system that let building departments, ICC recognized, and basically let HERS ratings substitute for the energy compliance in the International Energy Conservation Code. And what's happening now in this process that Chris is leading is basically developing an embodied carbon standard that will fit right into the ResNet HERS rating process. So it will make it easy for the raters who are already trained in doing the energy assessments to begin to include embodied carbon as well. And Canada, in many ways, has been out in front of the US. Europe is in front of all of us in terms of getting these things done. But there are a bunch of resources, and I don't know whether Chris is showing up at your conference. I hope he does, but and Jacob Racusin also is really involved in these things. There's some extraordinary people that are doing all this work, and I won't talk a lot about these things because I don't know a lot of the details, but you have fantastic people in Canada and in your organization who are leading these things. Hopefully you are all aware of this Beam tool that Chris and Builders for Climate Action developed. Extraordinarily useful tool in the design phase for you to look at materials and systems and understand in terms of the actual quantities of materials going into your building, to be able to actually see the climate impact of decisions you're making, trying to move towards zero climate impact or beneficial climate impact buildings. And Chris and Bruce King have been working on a bunch of things. Bruce's book from a few years ago, The New Carbon Architecture, and then the book they did together. Those are excellent resources. Highly recommended. And then in this photograph, I think if you look at the back on the right side, you see Chris hiding. Looks like he's photoshopped into that picture. He was actually there at the White House, this embodied carbon roundtable, with a bunch of other really fantastic people, many of whom have been working also in the natural building realm, in addition to, green building and regenerative building, etc.
And then also about what's happening actually right now, or just within the last few days. this is another example of meeting people or making connections in the process in this code's development arena. I was interviewed for this book that was published about a year ago, and another person who was interviewed, I was interviewed regarding straw bale construction. This University of Michigan academic, Matthew Lippincott, was interviewed regarding waterless toilets. So he and I connected, and then I helped him and his team put forth these two plumbing-related proposals, composting toilet and systems and urine diversion systems. And they were just heard this past week. One of them was disapproved, the composting toilet, although they were very encouraging. They had suggestions about how to improve it, and they want the proponents to come back the next hearings. The other one was approved first time around, so we were really happy with that. And then Anthony's going to say just a bit about testing and codes. They go back and forth. They're just strongly tied to each other. Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, in our practice, especially for structural engineers, just trying to get more permits and more of these buildings built that we care about, and you find you need more information to be going to the building department. So you engage with testing, maybe you end up with enough testing, you think you can actually propose a code, and then you have a code and some testing, you go back, get more permits. You know, it's this circular loop or triangle, all related. But testing these materials, they're very under-tested because there aren't that many proprietary driven industries funding test after test at universities, and they're weird when through the eyes of most labs and ASTM standards that govern the rules there. So they can be heavy and expensive and dirty and just difficult to plug into the system that exists that we've developed to be testing these materials. Next slide.
And if I can interject, they're also not industrialized materials or systems, so they're more variable, which means they need more testing.
Right. And through the years, many people in your community and our community and us ourselves have been successful at kind of forging ahead and getting some of the first rounds of these tests completed. Here's an example of thermal testing on Cobb construction, which really opened up the door to speak more clearly about the mass wall and insulation complexities of that system, when it's appropriate and when it's not, and how it applies to our codes. Here was the Cobb code was actually turned down in its first proposal by the committee, not because of structural qualities or most of the code, but because we were crediting a 1-hour fire rating, which is the equivalent of studs with chipboard on it for a material that we've traditionally made ovens out of. And because we didn't have the official ASTM E119 test, we were crediting a test from New Zealand. And so we went back and we had this test built. These panels, 10 by 10 by 1 foot thick, that are at nearly 6,000 pounds. They need to dry for months in the lab. You know, the complications, expensive, a lot of volunteer hours. But I'll show you the end of this test in the next slide. In the video here, they heat it for 2 hours. This is down in Bryan, Texas. And this cowboy, I think, really likes his job. It was nerve-wracking. We saw a lot of clay spraying off because the vitrified layer on the first 2 inches was getting blasted off by the hose. But as you see from the photos around it, it was a successful test. And the interior of the wall, we needed to be heated up to 2,000 degrees for 2 hours, while the exterior of the wall changed by less than 5 degrees, which was less than the floor slab of that building in the lab that day, just to fully document how powerful and these walls are in that kind of performance. Next slide. This is a table on this following slide of how we translated what we found out from those 2 wall sample tests to usable information in the code, in Appendix, what was formerly Appendix AU in the International Residential Code for Cobb, Monolithic, Adobe. This table now exists in there, and is a direct result. You know, you go through all the effort, you fundraise, you build it, you test it, and then finally, this is what we're going for, this slide right here. But next slide. There's lots of testing opportunities. If you're involved at a university or a lab, or you know, just have a ton of money that you want to put towards these efforts, we are happy to share our thoughts on the lowest hanging fruit and the biggest bang for their buck tests that are next up, most understudied, and will be most valuable in the code realm, permitting realm, across likely both of our countries. So don't hesitate to be in touch if you're interested in these subjects. Next slide. Here's a QR code, which we'll leave on for the next, through question and answers. This is resources for anything, not maybe everything we talked about, but links to the codes and other things we think you might find helpful. So please take advantage of that. Next slide. QR code stays up, don't worry. Thank you for having us. Again, we wish we could be there with you. It's a nice opportunity, but not nearly as fun. And please let us know the questions you have. And Tim, please jump in and tell us everything we got wrong about it.
All right, can you hear me now? I just unmuted. You guys can hear
Yes.
me? Okay, right on.
Tim, can you hear me still?
Yep.
Yeah, just one last slide that David and Anthony don't even know about, but I just added it at the last moment that I wanted to share.
Oh no.
Which is this.
Right on. That was you in 2006. I remember that. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yes, I can't go on.
Okay, yeah, 18 years ago. Woo!
Okay, here we go.
Can you still do that, Martin?
Oh, yes. If I do it now, you'd be looking at my feet.
That's fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to stay here near the computer and send you the questions. So who's got a question? I can't see everybody. Okay, go ahead.
Just a question on the adoption of these appendices. How and when could you move that into the non-residential building code and scale that up, right? Because right now you are contained within a slightly smaller scale to do that.
Did you guys hear that question? What would it take to scale up and get it into the IBC?
Yeah.
No pressure.
Anthony, you want to take that?
Sure. I mentioned that as one of the things up and coming. We're always thinking about that. The I-codes have a process for new lateral systems, earthquake and wind resisting systems, called FEMA P695, and it is a cumbersome document of peer review and testing makeup, and so we're exploring the opportunities to undergo that process, but that would be one of the major requirements for jumping to the IBC. Something else we realized, the U.S. Hemp Building Association hired us to do a review of what specifically for hempcrete and hemp lime it would take to get into the IBC, and we found that a lot of products are out there that you can buy hempcrete insulation, but for site-sourced, site-built hempcrete, which also applies to site-sourced, site-built straw bale, you don't have an insulation manufacturer, and the IECC, which governs insulation qualities for the IBC, it puts the burden on the insulation manufacturer to be documenting that you're meeting those standards. So there is no middle person there, and there's actually no way the code even talks about something like this. This would be the first time anything like this would be in the code, and so that's just some of the hurdles that come. You realize, oh, we're the very first people, not just dealing with this material, but talking about a way of this type of building being codified.
So I'll add one thing about that. In Europe, they're way out ahead of us. There's lots of, especially straw, prefab straw bale systems that are being widely used in a lot of countries in Europe. So they figured out how to deal with that issue, there, and we need to look at what they've done and how they've done it and see how that might how we might be able to utilize some of what they've done in making this change here, because we're going to need to figure that out.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to echo what Anthony was saying, that the way that approvals, especially in our prescriptive codes, get codified is currently through a manufacturing or an industry. The code expects industry to present it. And that's the way it's been set up, and they don't really know what to do exactly when there's no middleman, there's no salesperson, there's no big straw. So how do they do that? And how do... Another question. Yes.
I guess my question is more so on the municipal level.
Mm-hmm.
So what if, because it's like, Canada differs from the United States in that it's kind of 5 companies in a trench coat to the government.
Mm-hmm.
So what if your municipality is like very closely intertwined with developers? And so you're trying to build as an individual for yourself. You're not even trying to build, let's say, large scale, and you're trying to then present that to them. It's just like the navigating that is really difficult, especially when it's like a municipality that is like, they're focused on like the urban center, and they're applying similar restrictions to like more rural and like smaller like places that were like added to the municipality due to like expansion and like other governmental stuff.
I guess I could respond from the Canadian, but I wonder if you guys have any experience with that that you wanted to share, or I could just go from the Canadian point of view.
So one of the issues that we've seen a lot over a long period of time here in the States is that smaller communities and rural jurisdictions generally have little staff and little capacity, in their building departments, and they often really don't know how to deal with things that are outside of the very norm or the way things are done, in cities. And it's a problem that is a long-standing one. I don't know that we have great solutions. I know in the States, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, has had long-standing programs for rural housing for agricultural communities, and they've been able to assist a lot in various things, challenges that come up, but it's a real issue.
Yeah, I mean here, just like in the U.S., as far as I know, the codes are enforced by the municipality or the local civil government, and it's exactly like David said. The smaller municipalities are understaffed and underpaid, and are afraid of differences, and the larger ones are often, I wouldn't say they're overstaffed, but it can be exponentially more difficult to convince an urban municipality about some of these materials, even though, I mean, Terrell's had experience. The city of Toronto owned and operated straw bale buildings, and then we're telling, because the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand, or you have several people inside the code. As far as when you said about the councillors or the local community, the developers having input, that's absolutely true, because at least here in Canada, municipalities can modify the building code via bylaw. And so if there are certain individuals or interests that have influence with a local council, that can happen. And I don't know, vote, complain, I don't know. Yeah, get active. That's because at the same time, those are the people you can, organize. Yeah, exactly. Because those are that's the level of government that we can most easily engage with. You can find your councilors and talk to them. You can run for council. If you're Emily Neos, you can become mayor of Moab. I mean, but she's a pretty special person. So anyway, you guys, any more you wanted to chime in on that one?
There is the IBC. Oh, so Mark. Well, the IBC 10411, the alternative materials section, is a powerful document that gives jurisdictions a lot of power in the states here, and you have your alternative submittal process there. And if you do have a sympathetic municipality, which Tim was just speaking to, and I think the person asking the question might have been suggesting, like, if they want this, there is a lot of power that lies there, but when the municipality changes hands or changes their opinion, you know, that can just go away like that. We've seen that happen here. So it can be good, but it's not necessarily sustainable all the time.
That's one of the reasons it's good to try and get things codified in some way, even if it's local modifications, you know, to the code. Or, you know, that if you can get something sort of embedded, you know, in the system instead of depending on a friendly code official or zoning official or whatever, you know, it tends to have a longer impact and lifespan.
All right, anybody else?
If I may,
Yeah.
it's important to differentiate the scenarios like that are often a bylaw issue and not a code issue. So it's more of a local politics thing where you can just convince councillors. So it's not necessarily an issue with the material itself or the code, because the code could allow a pathway for it. It's a bylaw issue more often in Canada.
Yeah, and it can be both.
Well, I just say, sometimes it's a liability issue where they're afraid of the new material, and I found that, you know, using Tim's stamp, which is more important than an architect's stamp, has worked. So if the material is non-structural, sometimes an architect's stamp can help in getting it passed. And doing your research on, like with the straw bale thing, is knowing who owns what and how many buildings there are in the city that have the same material. It's a lot of gray hair, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes it's simply.
And it can result in the loss of gray hair.
Yeah. I used to have more hair too. I'm catching up with you, David. Catching up.
Yeah.
All right, we got another over here. Oh, yeah.
It seems that if we went for a performance-based system, we might be able to solve multiple problems at the same time. Could you speak to the issues of trying to get performance-based
Right.
codes?
Yeah. Did you guys hear that? Sylvia's wondering if we could just circumvent a lot of this by just saying, "Oh, we'll go for performance codes."
I'll speak to that. It's been mentioned a couple times, at least these, the IRC appendices are prescriptive, but, and the IRC itself is generally prescriptive, and I think, well, at least there's that one, the small buildings part of the Canadian code that's prescriptive. But and that's mostly true, but the fuller truth is that there is some performance language, at least in these natural building appendices in the IRC. And what I like to see ideally is both, because to give a prescriptive path and give a performance path. And we try to do that where we can. I agree that the performance path has, or performance language requirements have more, they're more flexible, more possibilities, but the flip side is they can require more convincing or evidence that what you're going to do is going to perform, whereas the prescriptive is it's already been vetted, so to speak, and okay, we're not even arguing whether that works. It works. So I think, yeah, go ahead, David.
I was just going to add that one of the things about performance is it requires sort of more capability on the part of those submitting, you know, a proposed design, and it requires the same thing on the part of those analyzing and, you know, responsible for approving that design. And I mean, there are real benefits to performance codes and performance approaches, and there are limitations or, you know, burdens that it adds as well. And this is where testing comes in. The more information you have about how these things actually perform, the easier it is to justify a design through a performance basis. And it gets really hard with a lot of these natural materials that don't have the, big industry, backing to do that.
Yeah.
And it's very important to note as well that both U.S. and Canada structural codes in our building codes, not just our prescriptive or not our prescriptive branches, are strength-based or at times stress-based and not performance-based structural codes. And so their performance-based structural codes are a very small representation in the U.S. and Canada right now. It's kind of a higher level structural practice. So we call it strength-based, and this is kind of really getting into the weeds of the vocab. But it's important though if you're talking to in the industry that I think what you're proposing is a strength-based code structurally, while other functions of the code would be performance-based.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to say though that at the last executive committee meeting that I was, because I am a member of the Standing Committee on Housing and Small Buildings for Part 9 for the National Model Code, although that's all in flux with this harmonization stuff, and I'm going to have to reapply. And I'll invite everybody here to apply to be a member of the they're going to just call us a talent pool, I think, and there's going to be a lot more ad hoc committees. That's a long thing, but one of the directors let drop that one of their primary goals after harmonization, which is probably going to take another 2 or 3 code cycles, will be to include a performance-based code along with the objective functional statements and the prescriptive. They're never going to drop the prescriptive. I think they might hope they could evolve the objective functional stuff into performance-based. But Anthony, you're absolutely right. The structural standards are going to remain strength-based. I can't see them. Yeah, the amount of testing that will be required to get. Anyway, that's in the weeds for sure. All right.
Can you ask me to put the last slide again?
Oh, can you guys click to the last slide?
Oh, this is it.
You want to take a picture? You want to take a picture of Martin standing on his head? Yeah. All right. Yeah. But it often requires performing gymnastics, absolutely, and being willing to sacrifice here. Oh, is that Pat?
Yeah, that was Pat.
Hey.
And this is proof that Martin at times can be quite headstrong.
Yeah. All right, we got any more? I mean, we could chat about the possibilities for a bit, and I wouldn't mind maybe having a little bit of a quick. I don't know how quick it'll be, but one of the slides that I sent, it's kind of in fine print at the bottom. It says that the deadline for code change request submissions for the 2030 code cycle in Canada is June 2024, and that's because. So it should be. You'll get there. It's because. So there it is. So I mean, again, long story, but we have a 5-year code cycle that we have not actually adhered to since 1990 and 1995. But then 1995, that was the change to the operational or to the functional statements, to the objective-based code, and that took 10 years. And they actually did publish in 2005. But then the 2010 code was in 2012. 2015 was in 2017, 2018, 2020 code was March of 2022, and then it still hasn't been adopted by Ontario. So that the body, the National Building Code, which is now the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes, has committed to, they're publishing every 5 years. Come hell or high water, they're going to do that. And what that means is, essentially, they've already got all of the work that they need, that they can handle between 2025 and 2030. It's all just catching up. And I can testify, we're working on stuff that people had submitted in the 90s, in terms of life safety stuff, grab bars in bathrooms, all kinds of things like that. And we're just behind. And so they want to have all their ducks in the row for the 2030 cycle by mid-year this year. So if we were gonna put together a bunch of code change requests about including global warming potential as a metric for embodied carbon, for adopting some of the IRC appendices, those need to happen in the next few months. I mean, you can still submit them, but if you don't submit them by June, they won't look at them until 2031. And that's, yeah, not to be too, no pressure, again. I don't know. What they're hoping is that with this new, instead of having dedicated committees, the committees are gonna be struck for a given code change request or body of code change requests. They will handle that task, then it will be dissolved, and then you go back into the talent pool and you get into a new committee. So that's the idea, but we'll see how it goes. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Tim, so there's no effort at the moment to submit anything by June 2024 for this purpose?
I've got a couple started with people, but I don't have the bandwidth to finish them. I've got there's a grad student that I was just talking with who's very interested. She should have her thesis done by May, and she's very interested in having one about global warming potential. She's going to focus that on real objective and functional statements. Because currently we have objective statements around resource depletion and stuff, but there are no functional statements attached to them. Well, there's some that are coming, but she's.
Is there a way to do like placeholder things? In other words, there's a bunch of time between, but to create some of these things without full detail.
Possibly. Yeah. I mean, whenever you submit one of these things, it gets vetted by staff, and I can tell you that if things look like a promising thing, if they are interpreted as meeting priorities, they can go into like a holding spot for sure. But
because it seems like that might be a really good strategy if there's a set of things that need to go in here, even though they're not fully ready for prime time. And if you could create the placeholders for them, and it's a few years to before they would get to them anyway. So
yeah, and then you could add to them. Yeah, I think that's a good strategy. How you would kind of get them to promise that, I'm not sure.
I would get for the climate stuff. I would get Chris Magwood on it.
Yeah, well, he's just over there. Chris, you got all kinds of time, right? Yeah.
He doesn't have anything to do.
Yeah. He's done all his current work, I can tell you.
I'm sure he's caught up.
A strategy we've taken related to this timing crunch, a lot of these efforts have been started way, way too late. And I don't think it's been good on our life expectancy timeline, but it has produced, and we've been successful here. But often we end up in this situation where it's mostly done, and all these contacts Martin and David have developed through the years, their phone calls and hey, can we have another week? Can we have another month? Exactly when do you need this? They see that we're making progress and that it's a high quality document. And it kind of is terrible when your deadline just keeps extending because you just keep working. But it gets the job done, and you could take the same unhealthy approach if you wanted.
I have some relationships with some of the managers, so I could make some inquiries. And see, but I think they must realize when people look at that they're asking for submissions essentially 6 years in advance. That's a hard ask.
Yeah, especially because nothing's changing very rapidly these days.
No. No, yeah, none of those things. Yeah, everything's on pause. Yeah. All right. Should we just get right down to that? Let's just a quick, we'll share a Google Doc and type this up. No, sorry, we have to, the bar is opening in 30 seconds. Okay. On that note, yeah, exactly. So I just want to thank you guys. This is excellent. You guys always inspire me, and it's always an educational time. So thanks, and everybody, let's give them a big hand. much. You guys have a great rest of your day, and we will raise at least one glass for you. I can tell you that.
Thank you. Have a great time, everybody. Be in touch if you have questions.
Yes.